The farmhouse smelled the way it always had, dust and cedar and something like old smoke that never quite left the walls. She stood in the doorway a long moment before she made herself step inside, the screen door groaning behind her, the same way it had when she was a girl running through it barefoot. Nobody had touched much since the funeral. The chairs still sat where he'd left them. The stove still had a coffee tin beside it, rusted shut. She moved through the front room slowly, her hand trailing along the back of his old chair, and then she saw it. The footlocker, pushed under the window, its green paint chipped down to bare metal at the corners. She hadn't opened it since she was a child, back when he used to warn her it was full of things not meant for little hands. She knelt now, the way she used to, and lifted the lid. Dust rose in a thin curl toward the light. Inside, folded with more care than anything else in that house, was a stack of quilts, heavier than they looked, dense with batting, the stitching so even it seemed machine-made, until she looked closer and saw the small human imperfections, the places where a hand had trembled just slightly and kept going anyway. She lifted the top one into her lap. It still smelled faintly of cotton and wood smoke, like the fields in October. Beneath it, wrapped in a yellowed handkerchief, she found a photograph, cracked at one corner, the color gone soft with age. It showed a pit of fire behind a low tin building, black smoke rolling up against a gray sky, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, a rusted pickup truck parked just outside the fence line. She turned it over, in pencil, in his handwriting, small and slanted. The burning autumn. She sat there a long while, the quilt heavy across her knees, the photograph resting on top of it like a key she hadn't known she needed. She could almost hear him now, not the frail voice from those last years, but the steadier one from when she was young, telling her stories on the porch while the crickets started up in the dark. She hadn't planned on staying long. She'd told herself she'd just come to close up the house, sort through what needed sorting, sell what needed selling. But now, holding this quilt that still held the ghost of smoke in its threads, she understood she wasn't going to leave without telling someone what it meant, where it had come from, what it had cost him, and why an old disabled veteran once spent an entire autumn hauling trash out of a burning pit like it was the last worthwhile thing left in the world. She closed the footlocker gently, quilt still in her arms, and began. It was the autumn after her grandmother had been gone 3 years, and the smoke had already started climbing over the tree line by the time he came out to check the fence posts along the cotton patch. He stood there a long while, cane sunk into the soft dirt, watching the gray column rise from behind the gin like something alive and hungry, unfurling itself against a sky the color of an old bruise. Every year around this time, the mill burned what it didn't want. The hulls, the tangled lint too short or too dirty to bale, the sweepings from the floor that nobody bothered weighing anymore. Every year he watched it, and every year something in his chest tightened like a fist, closing slow. His own crop that season was thin. The bolls had opened uneven, half of them stunted from a wet spring that had drowned the low rows before he could get the water off them. He'd walked the field that morning counting what he could still salvage, and the number had been small enough to make him sit down on an overturned bucket and just breathe for a minute, the ache in his knee flaring the way it always did when the weather turned. And now here was the smoke, thick and endless, carrying with it the smell of scorched cotton, that particular smell that reminded him, unwillingly, of things he'd rather not remember, smoke that didn't belong to any battlefield, but still found the same old nerve in him. He watched a truck pull away from the gin, loaded with baled cotton. Good cotton, the kind that would end up in shirts and sheets somewhere far from this county, while behind it the waste pit kept climbing skyward, turning good fiber into ash because nobody had found a reason to want it. He thought of his wife then, the way he did most days without meaning to, her hands quick and sure over a quilting frame, pulling raw cotton apart with the flat wooden cards until it turned soft and even as clouds. She'd never wasted a scrap of anything. Feed sacks became dish towels. Worn shirts became batting. She used to say waste wasn't just foolish, it was a kind of forgetting that everything had a use if you were patient enough to find it. He looked at the smoke a while longer, jaw tight, an idea starting to form somewhere he couldn't yet name. Then he turned back toward the house, the fence wire humming faintly behind him in the wind, and did not stop thinking about it for the rest of that day. He waited until dark settled proper over the county, until the last truck lights had swung off the Gin Road, and the only glow left was the low orange breathing of the waste pit against the night sky. Grandma always told it that he sat on the porch that evening with his coffee gone cold in his hand, watching the clock on the wall like it owed him something. Then, near 10, he stood, took his cane, and went out to the truck. The old pickup coughed twice before it caught, and he let it idle a minute, easing the ache in his knee before he pulled onto the gravel road. He drove with his lights low, not because he meant to hide exactly, but because a man raised the way he was didn't believe in announcing himself. He parked the truck in the shadow of the tree line behind the mill, where the fence sagged low enough for a man with a cane to step over if he took his time about it. The air near the pit was thick, sweet, and smoky, catching in his throat as he made his way toward the loose piles of lint scattered near the edge, the scraps too small or too tangled to be baled, too much trouble for anyone paid by the pound to bother with. He knelt slow, favoring the leg that never healed right, and began gathering handfuls into the burlap sack he'd brought folded under his coat. It was slow work. His fingers weren't what they used to be, and the cotton clung to the ground like it didn't want to leave, but he worked with the same patience he gave everything else in his life, steady, unhurried, like a man who had learned the hard way that most things worth doing couldn't be rushed. Every few minutes he'd glance toward the mill house, where a single bulb burned over the office door, and listen for footsteps that never came. By the time the sack was full, his shirt was damp against his back, and his leg had gone from ache to fire, but he hauled it over one shoulder anyway, leaning hard on the cane, and made his way back through the dark toward the truck. He loaded it into the bed, quiet as he could manage, the burlap thumping soft against the metal. He didn't look back at the pit as he pulled away, though the smoke behind him kept climbing, kept burning, indifferent to what he'd taken. He drove home with the windows down, the smell of scorched cotton fading behind him, replaced by the cooler air of the fields, and something in his chest that felt, for the first time in a long while, like purpose. I still remember the way she'd hold that quilt up to the window, checking for thin spots, the way you'd check a man's excuse for holes. She never trusted anything until she'd seen the light through it. I think about that now, folding back the footlocker's lid, the smell of cedar and something older underneath it. He went back to the mill 3 more nights that week, and the 4th time, he was slower than he should have been. His leg had been talking to him all day, a low grinding complaint that he'd learned to ignore the way you ignore a radio left on in another room. He didn't hear the truck pull in behind the mill house until its headlights swept across the pit and lit him up standing there with a half-full sack, cotton clinging to his sleeves like he'd been wrestling a cloud. 3 of the mill hands climbed out laughing before their boots even hit gravel. One of them had a flashlight and pointed it right at his face, like a spotlight at a county fair freak show. "Well, look at this," the man said, grinning at the others. Thought maybe we had raccoons. Turns out it's just the old scavenger. They circled him slow, the way young men do when they've found something to feel big about. One of them nudged the sack with his boot. You do know that's trash, right? We're fixin' to burn it. You're stealing garbage, old man. He didn't answer right away. He set the sack down easy, both hands on his cane, and let them laugh themselves out. He'd stood through worse than mockery. He'd stood through silence that could kill a man faster than any insult. By the time the mill owner arrived, pulling up in his good truck with the paint still shining, the story had already grown teeth. Trespassing, the owner said, before he'd even stepped all the way out. That's what this is. You've been coming here at night, taking what's not yours. Wasn't stopping anybody's work, he said, quiet, the way he always spoke. Just picking up what you were fixing to burn anyway. It's still mine to burn, the owner snapped, color rising in his face like he'd been the one embarrassed, not amused. You want to end up banned from this property? Because that's where this is headed. Folks'll start thinking we can't keep our own trash pits secure. The workers laughed again at that, softer now, glancing sideways like they weren't sure if they should still be enjoying it. He looked past the owner toward the smoke curling up from the pit, steady as it had been every night that week, and said nothing more. He picked the sack back up, slung it over his shoulder despite the fire climbing up his leg, and walked to the truck without hurrying, without arguing, like a man who already knew something none of them did yet. I still have the quilt he was carrying that night, folded now at the bottom of the cedar chest, and when I press my palm flat against it, I swear I can feel the truck's engine still humming underneath the stitches. He never told the mill owner he'd be back. He didn't need to. The next night the headlights came up the gravel, same as always, slow and steady. The way he did everything after the war took the run out of his stride. The workers had stopped laughing out loud by then, mostly, though a few still leaned on their shovels to watch, waiting for him to give up. He never did. Night after night the truck bed filled, and night after night the barn swallowed another 2-3 sacks, until the loft groaned soft under the weight of what the county called garbage. He kept the barn door latched, even though nobody wanted what was inside. That was its own kind of message, though he never said so. On quiet evenings, before the wood stove had caught good, he'd walk out there with the lantern and just stand among the sacks, running his hand down into the lint until his fingers found the deep, cool center of it, the part the sun and smoke hadn't touched. It wasn't trash under his palm, it was raw and soft and full of small burrs and seed husks that needed picking clean, but it was cotton, real cotton, the same kind his wife used to work between her fingers at the kitchen table 30 years before, back when her hands were quick and his were whole. He could still hear her voice some nights, patient the way she'd been patient with everything, showing him how to card the fibers straight before they ever touched the frame. Draw it slow, she used to say. Don't fight it. Let the teeth of the card do the work, not your arm. He'd fought it plenty back then, all elbow and impatience, until she laughed at him gently and took his hands in hers and guided the motion herself, over and over, till it stopped feeling like work and started feeling like a kind of listening. Now, alone with the lantern light catching the barn dust like slow-falling snow, he sat on an overturned bucket and pulled a handful of lint into his lap, working it the way she'd taught him, feeling the years fall away same as the burrs falling out beneath his fingers. The sacks kept climbing behind him, wall to wall, dark and quiet and waiting. He didn't know yet what all that waiting would turn into. He only knew that when winter came, he wasn't going to let a single ounce of it burn. The old treadle had sat in the corner of the front room for 3 years, covered with a sheet like something waiting for a funeral that never came. He pulled the sheet off on the first hard frost morning and stood looking at it a long while before he touched it. Her foot had worn a smooth hollow into the pedal, right where the ball of her foot used to rock it. He set his own boot there, careful, like stepping into a print left in wet cement, and pumped it slow until the wheel began to turn, creaking, complaining, then finally remembering itself. He fed the first carded bat through with hands that shook more than he wanted to admit. His fingers weren't hers, thicker, slower, scarred across the knuckles from work she'd never had to do. But the motion was still somewhere inside him, folded away like a letter he hadn't read in years. Draw it slow. Don't fight it. He said it under his breath sometimes, not sure if it was her voice or his own memory of her voice, and by the second week he couldn't tell the difference anymore. The quilting frame he built up on sawhorses in the front room, the way she used to have it, stretched wide enough that he had to walk around it like a man circling a pond. He layered the batting between two old sheets, stitching by lamplight long after the wood stove had burned down to coals. His cane leaned against the frame's edge, like it was standing guard. Some nights his hip locked up so bad he had to stitch sitting on the bucket, reaching up instead of down, and he'd curse himself, then laugh at himself, then keep going anyway because stopping felt like betrayal. The lint from the mill was rougher than what she used to buy in town, full of hulls and dust and stray bits of stem, but he'd learned by December how to card it clean, how to pick it before it ever touched the bat, how to coax the good fiber out from the waste, same as a man separating wheat from chaff. Each quilt came out heavier than the last, denser, warmer, holding heat like a wood stove held coal. He didn't know if that was skill or just stubbornness, probably both. By January, the front room smelled like raw cotton and lamp oil and the faint copper smell of an old man's sweat, and the quilts stacked against the wall grew from 1 to 3 to 6, each one plainer than a store-bought blanket, but somehow heavier, with something a store-bought blanket never carried. He didn't have a name for what that was yet. He only knew that when he wrapped himself in the first finished one that winter, lying alone in the dark, it felt less like cotton and more like being held. I stand in the doorway of that front room now, and I can still hear it, not the sound of it, but the shape of the silence he had to sew inside of. Because word gets around fast in a county that small. Somebody at the feed store said it first, I think, half laughing over a sack of seed corn, the old man's sewing garbage. Somebody else picked it up at church, passed it along after the second hymn like a bad plate of casserole. By the time it reached the diner counter, it had grown teeth. Trash quilts, they called them. Rag blankets. One of the younger farmers, the kind with a new truck and no patience for anything that didn't come from a catalog, said he heard the old veteran was hauling off cotton lint like a raccoon hauling off a chicken carcass, and everybody at the counter laughed like that was the funniest thing they'd heard all winter. He heard about it, of course. Somebody always makes sure a man hears about it. The feed store clerk mentioned it to his face once, grinning like it was a kindness, said something about how a man his age ought to be resting his knee, not digging through a burn pit like a stray dog. He didn't answer, just paid for his thread and his oil and walked out slow, the cane tapping against the wood floor in that same steady rhythm he never let anybody rattle. At night, though, alone with the treadle creaking under his boot, I think it must have sat on him different than he let show. A man carries pride, quiet, when he's used to carrying weight, quiet. But he kept stitching, kept picking hulls out of raw lint under the lamp, until his fingers ached worse than his knee did. He'd told her once. She never had to hear it said back. She just knew. that he wasn't going to leave anything behind that still had use in it. Not a tool, not a dog, not a bag of cottonseed lint nobody else wanted. That promise didn't come from the war. It came from watching things get thrown away his whole life and hating the waste of it more than he ever admitted out loud. So when the laughing reached him, he let it pass through like weather, didn't argue it, didn't explain it, just drove back to the mill the next night same as always, sacks rattling in the truck bed, the smoke from the burn pit curling up behind him like something trying to follow him home. And somewhere under that lamp, needle moving steady as a heartbeat, he kept building toward something none of them could see yet, something none of them would understand until it was standing right in front of them, warm and finished and undeniable. I found the first finished quilt folded at the bottom of the footlocker years later, and I remember thinking it didn't look like anything that started in a burn pit. The pattern ran in wide diamonds, cream and faded blue, stitched so tight you couldn't slide a fingernail between the rows. He'd made it through January, then February, then March, working by lamp after the chores were done, treadle creaking under his boot like something breathing. By the time the frost broke, he had 4 of them stacked on the spare bed, and a 5th half-finished on the frame, waiting. He didn't show them to anyone. That wasn't his way. He folded each one square as a flag and set it aside like it was just another chore finished, no different than mending a fence line. But something in him must have wanted them seen, because when the church bulletin went up about the spring charity drive, clothing, canned goods, whatever the county could spare for families still climbing out of a hard winter, he drove into town with one quilt wrapped in a feed sack on the seat beside him. The woman running the drive, thin-faced and busy with clipboard, barely looked at him at first. She'd heard about the mill, the sacks, the laughing men leaning on the fence. She figured him for a nuisance more than a donor, and she said so, gently, the way people say things they don't think will matter. But he set the sack down anyway and unfolded it right there on the folding table, careful, like he was handling something alive. She stopped talking. Her hands went to the corner of it before her words caught up. She ran her thumb along the stitching, held it up to the light coming through the church hall windows, turned it over to check the backing. He stood there quiet, cap in his hands, waiting the way he'd learned to wait for things that took their own time, for rain, for crops, for grief to loosen its grip. "I suppose," she said finally, more to herself than to him, "we could hang one on the back table." Just to fill space. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't even close to one, but he nodded like it was, thanked her, and walked back out to his truck with the same slow, even steps he always used, like a man who'd learned not to expect too much from a room full of strangers. He didn't know yet what that back table was about to do, neither did she, but somewhere in the folding of that quilt onto a spot nobody thought mattered, something had already started moving that no one in that church hall could stop. I go back to that back table sometimes, in my mind, the way you go back to a place where something quiet exploded. It started with a woman touching the edge of it, just passing by, coat still on, looking for the coffee urn probably, and her hand brushed the folded corner without her even meaning to stop. She stopped anyway. I wasn't there. I've only got this from the ladies who told it to me later, years later, like they were still trying to figure out what they'd seen. But they said she went still all over, the way you go still when you touch something warmer than it has any right to be. Then she picked it up, unfolded it right there on the table, which you weren't supposed to do, and held it against her arms like she was checking whether it fit a bed she didn't have with her. Somebody said something about the stitching. Somebody else came over, Within 20 minutes, there were 4 or 5 of them standing around that table that had been meant for overflow, for things nobody wanted, and none of them were talking about the coffee anymore. The historian was there by accident, a thin, careful woman from the county archive who'd come for the bake sale, if you can believe that, and ended up with her glasses pushed up on her forehead, running her fingers along a seam like she was reading Braille. She kept saying a word I didn't understand back then. Chain stitch quarter, some old regional pattern, hand-worked, gone out of practice so long that most of the women who'd known it were dead or too old to hold a needle anymore. She said she'd seen it exactly twice before in her life, both times in quilts older than she was, both times behind glass in a museum case. She asked whose it was. Nobody at that table could tell her, because nobody had thought to ask, because nobody had thought it mattered, because an hour before it had been a thing meant to fill space on a back table nobody looked at. Somebody finally remembered the name, the old man with the cap, the one who limped in and limped out and didn't stay for coffee. By the time the historian tracked down who that was, asking around, writing a name on the back of a bake sale flyer, the quilt had already been passed hand to hand so many times that the folding table had gone crooked from people leaning on it, and the woman who ran the charity drive was standing off to the side with her arms crossed, staring at the thing she'd almost left off the table altogether, looking like she was trying to remember exactly what she'd said to him on his way out the door. After that, things moved faster than the county was used to moving. My grandmother, I mean the woman who ran the drive, I never learned to call her anything else in my head but that. She drove out to the farmhouse herself, no phone call first, because there was no phone call to make. The line had been cut for non-payment 2 winters back, and he'd never bothered fixing it. She found him in the barn, treadle going, foot rising and falling in that same slow rhythm his wife had taught him, and she stood in the doorway a long minute before he even noticed her. She didn't apologize. That wasn't her way. She just asked if she could look at what he had. He had 11 quilts finished by then, stacked on a shelf he'd built himself out of scrap lumber, each one wrapped in an old sheet to keep the dust off. She unwrapped every single one on the barn floor, kneeling in the chaff and the dust motes swimming in the light, and didn't say a word until she was done. Then she said the historian wanted to come out. Then she said a man from a collector's newsletter had called the church twice already. Then she said, quieter, that she was sorry for what she'd said to him at the folding table, and he told her not to trouble herself over it, because trouble had never fixed a thing yet. Word does something in a small county that it doesn't do anywhere else. It doesn't just spread, it doubles back on itself, changes shape each time it passes a new mouth, until by the second week, strangers were driving out past the mill just to see the farmhouse, slowing their trucks at the fence line like they were looking at a roadside attraction. A woman from a downstate paper came with a notepad and asked him to explain the stitch pattern, and he tried, haltingly, using his wife's words more than his own, because those were the only words he had for it. A collector from 2 counties over offered him more money for a single quilt than he'd cleared off the cotton patch in 3 years combined, and he turned it down flat, not out of pride, but because he said that one wasn't finished being used yet. The men at the feed store who used to laugh into their coffee stopped laughing. Some of them started nodding at him in the aisles instead, careful nods, the kind men give when they're not sure whether an apology is owed or expected, so they split the difference and say nothing at all. He didn't need the nod, but I think, somewhere under that cap, he noticed it anyway. The mill owner came out on a Tuesday, and I remember it was a Tuesday because it was the day the water bill came, and my grandfather was sitting at the kitchen table with his checkbook when the truck pulled up, a truck too clean for our lane, and he watched it through the window the way he used to watch weather building on the horizon, patient, unsurprised, already knowing what shape it would take before it arrived. The mill owner didn't come in swinging like the old stories about him would suggest. He came up the porch steps slow, hat in his hand instead of on his head, which my grandfather told me later was the first thing he noticed, because a man who takes his hat off before he's asked to is a man who's already decided to lose the argument he came to have. He said the county had started asking questions about the smoke. He said a state man had come out with a clipboard and words like runoff and particulate that the mill owner repeated like they tasted bad in his mouth. He said the pit had been burning for longer than either of them had been alive, and he'd never once thought to ask what all that lint was worth until strangers started driving past his gin to look at a farmhouse instead. He said it plain, the way men say things they've rehearsed on the drive over and stopped rehearsing halfway through because the truth got simpler the closer he got to saying it. He said he was sorry. He said it twice, like the first one needed a second to hold it up. Then he asked if my grandfather would take the lint proper, sacks set aside before the burn pile ever got lit, hauled and weighed and paid for like any other crop, instead of picked through in the dark like a man stealing from his own county. My grandfather didn't answer right away. He looked out past the mill owner's clean truck toward the cotton patch, where the frost was already silvering the low rows, and I think he was doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with money, counting winters, counting what his wife would have said, counting how strange it was that the thing men once ran him off with flashlights for was now being offered to him with an apology folded into it like a shirt. "I never wanted trouble," he finally said, "just didn't want to see it burned." The mill owner nodded, like that answered something he hadn't quite known how to ask. They shook hands there on the porch, careful, the way two men shake when neither one knows yet what the handshake is going to mean, only that it means something, and that whatever comes next won't fit the shape of the county the way it used to. That handshake is the last clear memory I have of him standing on his own 2 feet without the cane trembling under his weight. He passed before the next autumn's cotton was even picked, and I think some part of the county knew it was coming, because when the harvest festival rolled around that year, nobody had to ask what the display tent in the center of the fairgrounds was going to hold. I stood there in September light, 30-some years old, looking at what they'd built without telling me half of it. A whole wall of his quilts, hung careful on dowels, the colors gone soft with years, but the stitching still tight as the day his hands pulled it through. Underneath, on a folding table somebody had covered in flannel, sat a hand-lettered sign that read, "The county's first Lint Quilt Award," and beside it, photographs. Him at his treadle, him with sacks in the truck bed, him young in a uniform nobody in town had ever seen before that week. The mill owner's son stood up at the microphone, because the mill owner himself had gotten too old to manage more than a few words, and he told the crowd what his father always said in his last years, that a man who wouldn't let good cotton burn was worth more to that county than most men who never burned anything at all. People clapped the way small towns clap, unevenly, but meaning it. They asked me to say something, and I hadn't planned to, but I found my way up there anyway, holding the last quilt he'd started, the one he never got to finish, its border still raw and unbound the week he died. Some of the church women had taken it up without asking, without making a fuss, and closed the edge exactly the way his wife used to close hers, so that if you didn't know better, you'd think one pair of hands had done the whole thing start to finish, decades apart. I laid it out flat across the display table. Then I took his old service cap, the one that had sat in the footlocker since the funeral, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil, and I folded it, careful, the way you'd fold a flag, and set it right there on top of the quilt, over the part where the batting was thickest, where the cotton he'd hauled through the dark had finally found its shape. Nobody laughed that day. Nobody had laughed in a long while, and standing there, I understood something he must have known all along, that the things a town throws away and the things it later kneels down to save are, more often than anyone wants to admit, exactly the same thing, only waiting on someone patient enough to notice.